The 2024 Iditarod gave the world the reason to condemn and not celebrate the dog race that's fast becoming a symbol of animal cruelty. This year, 3 dogs died in the 51st running of the sled dog race through Alaska. I talked to the activists leading the charge to end the Iditarod now on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, the romance of the Iditarod, that annual 1,000-mile dog sled race through the Alaskan wilderness, was shattered this year after the death of 3 dogs, the first deaths in the race since 2019. On Tuesday morning, a 3-year-old male dog named Henry collapsed on the trail as it raced on the team of musher Calvin Daughtry. 2 other dogs died last Sunday, a 2-year-old named Bog on the Isaac Tedford team, and a 4-year-old named George on the team of musher Hunter Keefe. The Iditarod is the shame of Alaska, PETA Executive Vice President Tracy Reiman said in a statement. How many more dogs need to die before this stops? Dogs' lives are worth more than this. The 3 deaths overshadowed the winner of the race, Dallas Seavey, 37, who won the race for the 6th time. But even he had a controversial ride with a moose incident that endangered a dog and forced Seavey to shoot the moose dead. The PETA campaigner leading the charge to stop the race is Melanie Johnson, who's been working on ending the Iditarod for the last 6 years. I talked to Johnson before news broke of the 3rd dog death and before Seavey crossed the finish line first. My conversation with PETA's Iditarod campaigner Melanie Johnson on the PETA Podcast. So, Melanie, what strikes me is that you've been on this campaign for 6 years. 6 years. Tell me, what was it like when you were there 6 years ago, starting a campaign to end the Iditarod, and where we are now? I mean, there's got to be some progress, huh?
Yeah, definitely. So 6 years ago, when we were just really amping up our campaign against the Iditarod, there were about 60 or so mushers who were signed up for the race, and that number has declined basically every year since then. This year, there were only 38 mushers who signed up, so it's really declining in popularity, and sponsors keep dropping out. We've had ExxonMobil, Chrysler, Jack Daniels, so many huge sponsors who have dropped their sponsorships because of our campaigns.
Yeah, and people have to understand this. This is a 1,000-mile sled dog race. It's a huge ordeal in Alaska, and people know it. I mean, it has historical roots going back to the 19th century, but the race has only been officially a race since about 1973. So, I mean, you're up against a kind of tradition, but not so much of a tradition that it can't be knocked down. So you must feel gratified that, you've gotten the diminished sense of, participation, and the advertisers are gone down. So that must make you feel like you've accomplished something in the 6 years, huh?
Yeah, definitely. And it feels like every year that we continue, we're so much closer to putting an end to the race for good.
All right. But now then this year, I mean, it must be a shock when you found out that a dog has actually died. The first time in 5 years. I mean, you've been at this 6 trying to stop the race, but this is the first time in 5 years when you heard that a dog named Bog, a 2-year-old male on the musher Isaac Tedford team, when he died on Sunday. What did you feel?
So I actually saw the death happen in real time because we monitor the Iditarod's live stream for incidents like that. And so I saw Bog collapse. I saw the musher try to pick him up. Bog was limp. He appeared lifeless. And then I heard Iditarod officials saying that they were doing CPR. And we didn't hear any updates for several hours until the Iditarod finally put out a statement saying that Bog had collapsed and died. We still don't know what the cause was, but he was definitely forced to run so hard that he died on the trail.
Wow. And Bog, what kind of dog is Bog? A husky? What sort of dogs are the best mushers that get recruited to do something like this?
So mushers usually use husky mixes. They claim that these dogs can withstand the cold and that that's why it's okay. But really, these dogs are no different from the ones that we love and share our homes with. And they would never want to be forced to race 1,000 miles until they die.
So they're not necessarily more muscular. They're not necessarily bigger. They're like regular dog. I mean, they don't have they're not bigger than an average companion animal who you have in your home.
Right. They're not super dogs. They're not these indestructible pieces of sporting equipment. They're really no different than the ones we have as our own companions. But the Iditarod tries to spin it as if these are some special dog.
And so Bog, when you saw Bog, what did it look like on the screen? Was he in pain? He was about 200 feet from the checkpoint in the village of Nulato, and he died. They were trying desperately to save him. But what did it look like on the screen to you? And what were you thinking when you saw it?
I was shocked. There hadn't been a death in the Iditarod since 2019. So I was shocked. I was appalled. I was sad. I actually started crying because it was so upsetting to see this happen, and especially knowing that it was happening right that very moment. When they called for CPR, I knew that Bog had died, that there was almost no chance that he was going to survive. We found out a few hours later that he did pass away.
You know that this kind of thing could occur all along since you started this campaign. And for every year that something goes on, that the race goes on and no deaths occur, then there's got to be a sigh of relief that no dog died during the race. But here you have one dog died. This is like 5 years since the last death. And now there was a second dog, George, a 4-year-old male on Hunter Keefe's team. They tried to resuscitate him, and he collapsed 35 miles from Caltag, which is about 629 miles into the race. Were you able to see what happened to George, the 4-year-old male?
We weren't able to see what happened to George because he was too far from the Iditarod's cameras, which are set up at each of the checkpoints. So when Bog died, he was close enough to the checkpoint that the cameras caught it. Yeah, we were not able to see George's death. I imagine it looked very similar to Bog's. And it's good that we have the footage of Bog so that people can see what happened, because there's no arguing with seeing that footage. And even dozens of the Iditarod's fans were upset upon seeing it as well.
And what did people say about George's death when you heard about it? How was it reported, or how did you learn of it? And what did the Iditarod say?
George technically died just about 15 minutes after Bog did, but the Iditarod didn't release it until about 12 hours later. So we learned about it the next morning, yesterday morning, and it was extremely disheartening and upsetting that another dog died. Unfortunately, not surprising because, it's the Iditarod. They're forcing dogs to race in these horrendous conditions, and more than 150 dogs have died during the race already. So it wasn't surprising, but it was extremely upsetting. And I just hope that these 2 dog deaths are the wake-up call that the remaining sponsors need to stop sponsoring the Iditarod.
When you say 150 dogs have died in the race, you're talking about in its entire history, correct?
Right. More than 150 dogs have died in the Iditarod's entire history, but that's just during the race, because the Iditarod is not required to report deaths that happen off the trail. So For example, 5 dogs died just a few months ago during training for the race, but those numbers don't count because it didn't happen on the trail. And that 150 doesn't even include all of the others who die during the off season while they're kept chained up outside in all weather extremes, or those dogs who were killed because they weren't fast or fit enough.
So even though the race ends, the dogs can develop ailments or develop symptoms that end up in death. So the race continues even though the race actually has ended. The pain, the suffering, the death, the cruelty to the animals continues even after the race is over.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that people don't often realize. They think once the Iditarod ends, maybe the dogs, go and they get to live inside for the rest of the year while they wait for the next race. But the reality is that most of these dogs are going right back outside. They're going to be chained up to plastic barrels or dilapidated wooden boxes in all weather extremes, the sub-zero temperatures, and even extreme heat with little to no protection at all.
And so what happens to the mushers like Teaford, Isaac Teaford? He's from Salt Lake City. It was his first race. He owned Bog, or he's the musher who is related to Bog. And then there's George, the 4-year-old male. He was on the team of Hunter Keefe, and Keefe is from Kinnick, Alaska. And so they have to, what is their responsibility? They withdrew from the race voluntarily because their dogs died. But what is their obligation, and what happens to them? What is their responsibility?
Nothing happens to them. They have no responsibility because in Alaska, the dog sledding events like the Iditarod are exempt from the state's cruelty to animals statute. So what would happen to someone's companion dog does not apply to the dogs who are forced to race in the Iditarod.
Wow. So if this were like an ordinary citizen with a dog, and he was out having fun with their dog, racing them, there would be animal cruelty laws applied if a dog was hurt or died.
Yeah, exactly. If this happened anywhere else under any other circumstances, the person who killed these dogs would be facing cruelty to animals charges and would probably be sitting in jail right now.
And because the Iditarod is an officially sanctioned cruelty event that everyone is involved in, with the sponsors and the racers and the local governments, then they're given a pass on anything, even when 2 dogs die.
Exactly. They're facing no consequences for it. All they had to do was withdraw from the race.
That doesn't sound right.
It's not right. And it's just another reason why the Iditarod really needs to end, because whatever happens during the race, the mushers aren't facing penalties for it because they're exempt from the state law.
Tracy Reiman, the executive vice president of PETA, said the mushers, Liberty Media, a top Iditarod sponsor, and anyone else enabling this shameful death race to continue all have Boggs and George's blood on their hands. What should happen now to Liberty Media? What should happen to the entire, the race infrastructure? Should they shut down, given that the 2 deaths have occurred? It just seems kind of odd that they don't even pause. They just keep going. I mean, the mushers who are, they have left. They voluntarily withdrew, the owners of the 2 dogs. But everyone else just continued like nothing happened.
It's actually in the Iditarod's official rule book that some dog deaths are considered unpreventable hazards. So that's just another reason why they continue as if everything is normal, because they do think it's normal.
And what will happen now? They're going to do a necropsy to find out what happened. I mean, who knows what they can find. If the dogs were, maybe they were drugged with something. Maybe the dogs were hurt and were made to run faster because to heal some kind of condition. I mean, who knows what they'll find with a necropsy? What do you think they'll find? What do you suspect?
I know that the leading cause of death for dogs running the Iditarod is aspiration pneumonia, which is caused by inhaling their own vomit. But dogs have also died from heart attacks, from being buried alive in the snow, from hyperthermia and hypothermia. So I would not be surprised if these dogs died from either heart attacks or aspiration pneumonia or something like that. But we'll just have to wait for the necropsies to come out and see what they find.
Is it similar to something like in horse racing where if you have an injured animal, you might give it a medication to make it not feel the pain and then run through the pain? Is there something like that that happens, or would there be medications given to dogs if they were sick to maybe deal with the conditions of potential pneumonia or vomiting?
Most of those are against race rules, and mushers have been banned from racing in the Iditarod for a certain amount of time because of doping scandals. So I don't know how common it is if they can avoid that, but I believe that the race does check for any substances that are in the dogs' bodies.
The necropsies are going to come. They have to do them within 30 days. And then there's independent investigators involved. Do you suspect that anything will come out of, just an intense look at what happened to George and to Bog, the two who died?
I do. I think once people find out how these dogs were raced to death, whatever the exact cause of death is, I think it's going to be really difficult for them to look at the race as anything other than a blood sport and a deadly race.
I mean, it is a blood sport if nothing is done. They race to their deaths. But now, last week, PETA called for musher Dallas Seavey, he's like the star of the Iditarod, a 5-time winner. PETA called for his removal after his dog Falou was injured in an encounter with a moose. How did Dallas Seavey and his dogs encounter a moose, and why? What happened?
So it's not uncommon for mushers to encounter moose on the trail because they are in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. But this moose, who was minding his own business, living in his natural environment, got entangled with the dogs. And so Dallas Seavey shot and killed the moose after the moose severely injured Falou, as you mentioned. And so per Iditarod rules, Dallas had to gut the moose before moving on. And so he spent about 10 minutes removing the moose's organs so that their flesh could be salvaged. And instead of turning back to the previous checkpoint, which was about 2 hours away, he spent 8 hours going to the next checkpoint so that he could continue racing, so that he wouldn't lose his spot, even though his dog was in critical condition.
Well, Falou, the injured dog, I mean, it's bad enough the moose was shot and gutted, but then what happened to Falou, the injured dog? He continued to race?
He was put in the sled bag. So that's where they put the dogs who can't race anymore. And then when they get to the next checkpoint, they what they call drop the dog. So as soon as Dallas got to the next checkpoint, Falou was airlifted to emergency surgery. She could have gotten care hours earlier if Dallas cared at all about his dogs instead of about winning the race.
But Falou is okay right now. We know, we hope after being treated.
Yeah, the good news is that Falou is okay. She has returned back to Dallas's kennel. But the fact is the vets reportedly gave her a 20% chance of survival. And so it's a miracle that she survived at all. And Dallas really should have gotten her care much sooner than he did.
And the mishap with the moose, was it, they just describe it as an encounter. Was the moose and the dog, were they fighting, or did they get into some kind of skirmish there?
They just described it as an aggressive moose getting entangled with the dogs and the sled line. The moose, he or she was just doing what they would in their natural habitat, and just, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So not only did Falou have to get emergency surgery, but a moose unnecessarily was killed for the race.
Right, because CV shot the moose.
Yeah.
Which is like, all right, so they're not only are they dangerous because they're racing these sled dogs, they're armed and dangerous.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And they shoot everything in sight, it seems. I mean, there's this moose who is minding. I mean, I know I've been to Alaska a couple of times, and there are moose in the neighborhoods, right?
Right.
And so and they're peaceful. I mean, I was scared out of my wits when I first saw one, but they go away and mind their business when they come up and, nip at your trees and your bushes and whatnot. But I imagine out in the wild, it might be slightly more dangerous, but still, I don't know if the moose had to give up its life.
Yeah, and Dallas is the one who put the dogs in danger. So if he wasn't forcing the dogs to race, if the Iditarod in general wasn't forcing the dogs to race, these dogs wouldn't have been put in that situation, and the moose wouldn't have had to die at all.
And now we have CV, who has done this, killed a moose, endangered his dog, endangered other dogs. He continues in the race, the 5-time winner, like he's some kind of hero.
Yeah, exactly.
In the meantime, the 2 other mushers, they've involuntarily withdrawn from the race, but their dogs have passed, and nothing really is stopping the race. It continues still. It's just, I think that people, if they had a problem with the Iditarod, and some Alaskans, some natives there do have problems with PETA's stand, because they see this as part of their culture. And everyone else in the lower 49, or 48 rather, because Hawaii is sort of out there, most people don't think about Iditarod. But if they understand this story, they see what a cruel race it really is.
Yeah, and one good thing that came out of all of this is that these dog deaths have garnered national coverage. So people all around the country who probably haven't even heard of the Iditarod, now they're hearing about it, and they're knowing that the Iditarod kills dogs and endangers other dogs.
What are you going to do as head of this campaign? What is next? You don't have to reveal the entire strategy, but going forward, I mean, you must feel like, oh, we're close to like ending this thing now, because look at the blood. Look at the blood of the dogs. It just happened, on Sunday, and people need to see we could stop the race now. Are you encouraged?
Yeah, I am encouraged. I feel like the outrage is there. People are really upset about this. Now is the time for the Iditarod to end. And so PETA's using that pressure to urge the Iditarod's remaining sponsors, like Liberty Media, as you mentioned earlier, to stop funding this hideous cycle of torment and death, because these dogs, George and Bog, their deaths are on Liberty Media's hands, because Liberty continues to fund this cruelty.
Melanie Johnson, PETA senior campaigner, working toward ending the Iditarod. After 3 dog deaths this year, the message is clear. The Iditarod is not a sport, but an annual excuse for animal cruelty. Find out how you can join the effort to stop the Iditarod. Go to PETA.org. that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of the show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or see my vlog at AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog, or see my one-man show, Emil Amok, Lost NPR host, and other Amok monologues at the New York City Fringe Festival in April. That's right, in the East Village at Under St. Mark's Theater, New York City Fringe Festival, and also the Orlando Fringe Festival in May. And get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.